So, let's see, a little background. First off, I just want to say that I could trash this whole thing. We could rewatch Kevin's video. I could just say, that's Chinese medicine, that's Chinese medicine, that's Chinese medicine, over and over again. There are so many correlations, one of which that spring to mind immediately, one of which is in terms of the symbolism of the organs. The heart is likened to a horse, and the pericardium, which is the aspect of the protective aspect of the heart, that which interacts, right? So the heart in Chinese medicine is strictly a steady state phenomena, and the pericardium is the load overload barrier to that steady state. And it corresponds to, the pericardium corresponds to all of the machinations of our personality in terms of what we call behavior. So all life exists, life functions as a means of coming into heart contact, bringing hearts into contact so that we can remain intact in our being. And in the process of that, enable that being to unfold into our becoming and into the evolution of our being, in the fullness of our being. And so what's necessary to that is, of course, drive. And that drive is personified, or is anthropomorphized, or the opposite of anthropomorphized, is symbolized as a dragon. So you have this correlation between the dragon, the horse, the dog, associated with the pericardium, all of these things existing together, functioning together, creating an autopoietic system which strives to bring hearts into contact through taking things in, eating them, joining them, eating them or joining them. And so there's just so many correlations that it's hard to even fathom all of them. Last year I was just super excited. I was super excited about discussing some of those correlations, and then Kevin brought in the wolf behavior that was so prominent in the video today. And I drew so much inspiration from that, especially when you take that into the context of, right, when you put that in the context of the introduction of the wolves back into Yellowstone, and then the changes that happened in the whole ecosystem as a result of that. And that's how I like to think about every patient that I'm working with, I'm trying to bring them into a state of greater freedom and autonomy and a more heart-centered feeling life. And the more we are capable of doing that, then the greater the changes that we can achieve socially, broadly, just as the ecosystem can change from the introduction of that pack. So the other aspect of it is that just as Kevin was describing fear as a kind of collapse, you'll see that that's also reflected precisely in Chinese medicine as well. So we start out with the idea that emotion is a direction. And as far as the emotion as a direction is concerned, we have to have, within Chinese medicine, we have almost a cosmological or cosmos-generating perspective, which begins from a state of unity. And that unity is, of course, all things in Chinese medicine develop according to number and pattern. And the thing that governs the dynamics of our experience and the dynamics of our life force and energy is number and pattern. So number proceeds like it starts from 1, and imbued into that state of unity and into that oneness, the breath of life is introduced into that oneness. And when the breath of life is introduced into that oneness, it develops the capacity to bifurcate. And so then you have another unity, but it's comprised of 2 poles, and those 2 poles are called yin and yang. So like all things that move in all things that breathe, and the movement of all force, there is a contraction and dilation that is responsible for the movement of these changes. And so you have a state from 1 that opens to 2, and then has to reorganize itself around a central pole. So that's the influence of heaven is described as the yang influence, and the influence of earth is described as the yin influence, and in between that you have humanity. And humanity is actually the means by which the pure creativity of an activity of heaven and the receptivity and the form and the vessel for that activity derived from earth come together. And they come together perfectly in the form of human beings with our upright posture. So from 3, we then have to also expand again. So then that expands out to the number 4, and the number 4 is spreading out in all directions, right? It's yin and yang. It's the number 2 in the form of yin and yang, and then making coordinates of those out of 4. So then we have those 4 directions. So that's the introduction of space, right? So now we've moved into elaborating space. From that elaboration of space, the Chinese recognize that that space will continue if it doesn't reorganize itself around a center. So the number 5 is the introduction of a center to the periphery of the space of 4. So at that point, we can imagine, as the Chinese imagined, that heaven is circular in its activity, and therefore cyclical also in its activity, but that the earth was square because it had those components of space. So as soon as we introduce 4, we have a basic pattern, and that is the Chinese recognized, or the Chinese articulated, that the sage always faces south. So the orientation of the Chinese perspective is oriented towards the south. So south is here, north is here, east is here, and west is here, and center is here. Now that sets us up for an image where we are standing on the earth, which is the center, and we can look to the east and we can see the sun rising. And so everything that has the quality of initiating movement necessarily comes from the east. When it reaches its apogee, when the sun rises to the point of noon, it's directly above us, and that's in the south. And as it begins to decline and set in the west, that's the downbearing of that energy. And as then we know clearly, as soon as the sun sets, it returns back into the primordial waters. We have no idea where it's gone. And yet we are confident, we have relative degree of faith that it will probably rise again tomorrow. So this is like a basic image of the Chinese worldview. As it happens, of course, that also represents winter, spring, summer, and fall. Right? So the 4 seasons are represented there. And the center, the earth, is the pivot point, right? The center is not it's the fulcrum in this system of levers. It's not an actual part of the levers themselves, right? So that the earth is what the seasons return to in between each season, right? So in actuality, what we end up with is a picture that's like this. With everything always returning back to the earth. So here we are, we've established that likewise we know that there is the winter of our discontent. So we have this thing where since this represents the dark and the north and the unseen aspects of experience, we recognize that this ineffable quality that we call life emerges from that unseen area, from that unseen region. And that includes all of the aspects of our ancestry, of our lineage, of the transmission of that lineage. All is fused into this experience of life emerging from the unseen. And yet, just like gestation, it appears, it remains hidden until it emerges, like the sun emerges. So that we can likewise, as we can understand this to represent space, we can understand this to represent the seasons, we can understand this also to represent the entirety of a lifetime. So that you have birth on the eastern side of this deep point, and you have death occurring at the point where you return back into that unknown. So that the whole scope of this, which is ultimately the unfolding of yang, which is fueled by the initiation of things, the fullness of expression, and then the closing of that activity. So you have some kind of a want arising, and you have the drive to find, to join with the flow to satisfy that. And then you have to close that down. In order to do something, in order to actually take that into us, we have to be able to close that activity. So here in the West, we have all of the down-bearing aspects of our physiology, the ones that start at the mouth and end at the anus, and transform matter into energy and then back into flesh as a result. So I can initiate the chase, I can accomplish the chase, and then I can eat my fill. And if I can do that, I can have progeny. So that's the orientation towards 5. And then the next step is that we can also that 5, we have to allow that to expand, and when that expands, it's as if we're taking this cycle of 5 and introducing more energy into it and more movement into it. So we can also divide this up into a set of 6. And when we divide it up into a set of 6, we recognize that is showing us a yang aspect of the pivoting into activity, the fullness of the activity, and the closing of the activity. And then again, pivoting into the depths, opening to the depths, and then closing the depths so that something can emerge here. Does everybody follow that? Okay, so that's called Shaoyin, Jueyin, Shaoyang, Taiyang, Yangming, and this is called Taiyin. So that's a way of describing how these 3 movements are present in the world and in the unseen aspects, externally and internally. Okay, now that's fundamental background to understand where we go from here. So, the fundamental bedrock of this is respect. That is to say that we are not created equal except for the respect which we may demand for who we are. Now that's a way of saying that we can still recognize the hierarchy of the fact that that within the pack there's that hierarchy, but when it enters into flow, it's a question of delegation. And the same thing is true that we must command respect simply for our being, not for our doing. And that we should be accorded that. And the according of that is called unconditional positive regard. And that's the fundamental basis. So that means that, no, the fact is, we do not all come into this world equally robust. Yet we all deserve to be treated with the same respect. So, as that life pattern unfolds, right now, I'm not going to read this out to you, given that I try to, my compromise with PowerPoint is to do it completely wrong. So you can take a look at that, and I'll explain what it means. So this is a way of saying that, again, there's no such thing as bad energy. There's no such thing as bad connection. Every behavior is a means by which someone is trying to make contact in order to maintain the intactness of their being. Now that means that as a person is moving through these cycles, which are happening all the time simultaneously and sequentially and non-sequentially, that into that life, then if this is the point of birth, then this region of that would be the point of like all the development through the toddler years, all of the point wherein all language is acquired, wherein all integration of the neuromusculoskeletal, of the nervous system and the musculoskeletal system is brought together. All that occurs here. And all of this brings all of the energy that we could call the entirety of our life force into the act of actually defying gravity. Now, if you take the act of defying gravity, which means that I'm going to go from being not moving to lifting my head, and then I'm going to get up on my hands and knees, and then I'm going to stand up with assistance, and then I'm going to start taking those first steps, all of which are ways of trying to efficiently move a complex system through space. If you extrapolate that out to further reaches of human behavior, if this means not just that developmental period, but it also means the point at which you're trying to direct all of your life force into the accomplishment of to encountering some obstacle and overcoming some obstacle, that means that that this aspect of that circle is activated anytime you encounter something to which you must overcome, or so every time you encounter something that you must overcome. One of the most prominent things that we must overcome is the received opinion about how we should be. So in our family of origin, right, we may be told, you will do this, and if you do that, you will win approval. And the point of this terrible period of being is to say no. Now as that expresses itself in later years, that no becomes perhaps more vehement. And the response to that can be either to accommodate that or to not accommodate it. And as it happens in the dominant culture, the response to that no is usually a punitive response. Right? That's like, now if that desire to declare, I am not what you say I am what I am, and I deserve to be treated with respect for my being, well, if that's met with abuse, that means that suddenly a deficit is created here. Now, contact to stay intact means that a person, as this deficit is established by their experience, will find a way to overcome it. Right? Nature will find a way to continue this cycle. The body will find a way to continue this cycle. And the fact is that it will bring our attention to this. One of the upshots of that is that it will bring our attention to this in a way that will draw our attention to the vulnerability. So this becomes a defining factor of our terrain, and then any stress that we encounter gets drawn to that crack. Right? It gets drawn to that vulnerability. It can enter, as most things do, from the surface. It can enter here, but it'll trend down here. So that means when any stress from the external world comes in, it could manifest here, and the body will try to manifest a response to that. So if I've been told, for example, that I cannot be accorded the respect I deserve for what I am, I'm only accorded the respect that I deserve for what I do, and then anytime I do not do what I am instructed to do, that's met with punishment. I will then adapt to that by trying to do as much as I can to win approval. that I would otherwise be missing. And what that means is, right, I might adopt a perfectionistic attitude. I might adopt a pattern of working beyond my energy. I might push myself to excel so much that I exhaust myself. So the symptom that will develop from that will be a symptom from this compensatory mechanism that will be derived from the set of behaviors that are trying to maintain contact, to stay intact. And so that's a patient that comes in and they say, I'm exhausted and my muscles hurt and I'm exhausted and my eyes are getting worse, all of which are associated with this kind of all of which are associated with this aspect of things, the liver aspect of things, the blood-moving aspect of things. Those symptoms will arise precisely because of the behaviors that a person is using to try to bolster their sense of self, to stay intact. And that's a description of the compensatory attributes. And those are the things that ultimately are not. That allows us to reframe symptoms and reframe behaviors and reframe defense mechanisms as positive means of trying to make contact. And that means that every single symptom is trying to communicate something to us. Every single symptom that we can experience, which is human beings experience a very limited number of symptoms. Right? The number of symptoms the human body can produce is limited. You can have abdominal pain, and the source of that abdominal pain could be menstrual, or it could be because you were stabbed in the stomach, or it could be passing gas. It's still the same thing, abdominal pain. Right? So that means that the causes of symptoms are without limit, but there is in fact a limited number of ways that the body can communicate to us. So this could mean, what that means is that this could be an emotional stress, but the body will find a way in staying intact and in instituting a compensatory attribute, the body will find a way to negotiate through that. So whether it's a stress that's emotional or a stress that's physical, wherever the vulnerability and the compensatory dynamic is found, that's where the symptoms will be. And the symptoms are trying to tell you, hey, take a rest. Right? So a patient that has a migraine every 14 days because they're overworking and they're working too long hours and they're exhausting themselves, the body responds by creating a condition which will force that person to lie down in a dark room overnight and take extra rest. And that's the intelligence of the body recalibrating this. Now, if we're going to allow that these movements, right? So, what do we call all of this force rising up and vehemently saying no? We could call that anger. Now, if that cycle doesn't get adapted, then it keeps going and it becomes rage. Right? That energy doesn't stop and it just keeps going. So it goes to the highest place. It actually surpasses the highest place and is displaced out of you in the form of violence or rage. Now, if we can understand that basic, right, the Chinese recognize fear, grief, sadness, pensiveness, anger. If we can recognize those as movements of energy, where this anger is a sudden rising movement of energy, just as you would feel it rising up in you, then why not pretense, denial, projection, repression, reaction formation, all of the patterns of behaviors that have been identified by modern Western psychology can be applied to this same model when, just like symptoms, there's only a certain number of ways that the body can have behavioral symptoms as well. So, the unfolding of this whole process can be described as the can be described as the process of becoming, or the evolution of being. And here we see how this correlates precisely to the constructal law. So the unfolding of the life force in continuous increments of increasingly complex organization, function, and performance. And that plays out through all strata of the human body. That plays out through the physical aspects, through what we could call the vital aspects or energetic aspects, through the emotional aspects, through the mental aspects, and through the spiritual aspects, equally the same. Now, I teach a year-long class on Chinese medicine pathology, and then the following year after that, I teach a 2-semester course on Chinese medical psychology. And I invariably, in day 1 of the first pathology class, where I also go on to say pathology is a complete misnomer because I don't believe there's anything that's pathological in actuality, is that we're going to spend a year and a half roughly describing what amounts to one single pathology. And there is only one pathology. And that means that the only pathology is moving against this flow of becoming. Now, let's take an example of that. If, in fact, this Yang Ming is associated with the stomach, and so that's the means by which, richly endowed with energy, richly endowed with what we call qi in blood, the Yang Ming is capable of expressing its hunger and then taking in the material, radically transforming it into energy and then back into flesh. So the direction of that necessarily is down and in, right? That is, or in and down. And so the energy of the stomach is supposed to always go in and down. And so flowing against, in the case of the stomach, is vomiting. Or flowing against is the arresting of that movement because it completes itself through elimination. So likewise, if it's not moving backwards and causing vomiting, then it's not going downwards and it's causing constipation. Now you can take that and you can apply that if this energy, this drive to take in substance, if that's directed towards something other than food, if that's directed towards peak experiences, let's say, that could equally manifest as like a manic episode, right? That a manic episode and a fever and vomiting, these are all expressions of movement that should be going down and being assimilated, that isn't being assimilated and instead is being ejected out into the world. And on the other hand, if I'm going to take in something new, I need to be able to separate. If I'm going to encounter a new idea, I need to be able to take that in as I take in my breath, root that breath down in my body, or I need to take that idea in as a substance and then turn that into an aspect of my autonomy and my being. That's analogous to taking in food and turning it into muscle. In order to do that, of course, as the metanoia of myself changing as it encounters new things also requires that I'm capable of eliminating those aspects of myself that are no longer serving me. Right? So I can have a personality constipation as well. Okay, now this one, where I really violate the rules. Right? This is just an elaboration of all of the ways in which all of the different organs of the body, which can be organized according to this pattern, each contribute to the process of our becoming. We take in ideas, they come into the heart divides them up and makes them the capacity to as I was just saying, to take in the new and let go the old is the function of the metal, which would be corresponding to the lung and also to the large intestine. And finally, we have the return back to the water. So if this is the breath, it's as if through the means of awareness of the breath, we can come back into a quiescent state that allows us to immerse ourselves back into the unknowns of our experience. So that's what that's describing. Now here's where we get to the real form of direction. So this is from one of the oldest basic medical texts of Chinese medicine, and in a chapter, incidentally, that is titled On Pain, we get this articulation of what happens, the direction that the energy moves when we encounter different emotions. So when one is angry, then the qi rises. So here we see that anger happening on this side. When one is joyous, it says the qi relaxes. Now, if this is summer and this is the fullness of expression, here we have, right, a shoot that's, at this point, a shoot that's just emerging from underground, and all of the roots are here. Right? All the roots have spread out, and then the shoot emerges. And when that grows to be the full, complete tree with the canopy open to the full light of the sun, that's the height of summer, and that's the experience of the qi coming out to the surface and being present at the surface and being met at the surface by the warmth of summer. And that's the meaning of qi relaxes and is joyful and moderate. And that means also that the moderation here is itself an expression of the heart. So if the heart is this steady state aspect of our being that corresponds to our self-awareness and to the full expression of our being, free from all of the outside influences, but free to express itself, that's the activity of the heart, that's the true expression of the heart, and that is also another way of saying the relaxing of the qi. So when one is sad, then the qi dissipates. And that's like when one encounters something sad and it arrests the breath. And so it says, in further elaboration, it says that the lobes of the lung, which are likened to leaves covering over a pot, right? Like leaves as a cover to a pot. The lungs are in the upper part of the body like that. That the lobes tighten. That life within the leaf dries and dissipates. And that's just like arresting the breath. There's a potentially apocryphal statement by one of the greatest Chinese medicine physicians that ever lived, whose name was Sun Miao, who may or may not have said that most diseases can arise from a single arresting of the breath, right? From a single moment of stopping the breath. When one is in fear, then the qi moves down, and this is what Kevin was talking about as collapse. Now that means when at the surface where I'm encountering the world, if fearful things come into my experience, if it's adequately fearful, it can move all the way through these centers and bring me down into the waters of the kidney, to the adrenals, to the fight or flight syndrome, and that's a form of collapse. In the case of cold, the qi collects. And the collecting of the cold, that collection is a form of constriction. So if we are standing on the earth, the fact is that we're standing on a rock hurtling through space for a reason that we can't quite comprehend, and not knowing where we're going. And that can engender fear in us, which will be like water kind of overtaking us and inundating us. And at the same time, it's possible that, in fact, as we are on this Earth, that an asteroid is going to come and hit us in the back of the head. And so our response to that, that's like cold, right? The asteroid is like an influence from outside that comes into our experience and causes us to constrict. Now you can take that as any number of things that in our environment we are unable to adapt to. Now environmentally that means literally changes in temperature. Our body has to physically at its surface adapt to the changes of temperature. On the other hand, that could mean anything which is injurious to the unfolding of this whole cycle, right? Anything that is injurious to the unfolding of the yang cycle of our life, anything that arrests its forward movement or decelerates it or moves it counterflow is an insult to this terrain, and it has to come into contact with us somehow. And our response, and it does so as if it's coming into our surface. And the response to that is to constrict. Right? Now, that means that you're taking this energy that's at the surface. Now, if we want to imagine how the Chinese conceived of this, it's like the sun is shining down on us, and just like an animal, right? The part of us that is most exposed to the sun is the back. And so that's the aspect that they conceive as where things come into us. So the response to that is that this fear wells up to the surface, and in order to contain that fear, I adopt a posture like this, right? I fold myself into a little kidney, right? A fetal position and the kidney look exactly the same. So that's the influence of cold, and that's why the cold is the predominant agent of disease in the Chinese conception. So in the case of heat, the qi flows out. So if that heat is, so this is an example of heat flowing out, right? Rage would be an example of that body heat and that want like exceeding its limit and flowing out. A very high fever with an extreme amount of sweating would likewise also be qi flowing out because it's being pushed out by heat. And as we know, heat necessarily rises. While cold constricts, heat expands. And so all of these regions of our physiology, they can all express this pattern of like pushing energy out. So any form of bleeding is usually because there's inflammation. The inflammation damages and dries the tissue. When the tissue dries, under the influence of this inflammation, it then pushes blood out, right? So you'll have bloody nose. If it's in the lungs, you'll be coughing up blood. If it's in the rectum, it'll be coming out with your stool. And that's all heat pushing out qi. Now, when one is frightened, then the qi is in disorder. That's the startle response. And that disorder means that the center is lost. And so all of the lighter, faster energy comes to the surface, and all of the heavier, more calming energy recedes into the recesses and ultimately loses functional contact. And this is one of the ways in which if the nourishing aspects of our being are constrained and the protective aspects of our being are inchoate, that means that we're vulnerable, because anywhere in this pattern from here to there, any insult that comes in is going to go directly to our center and knock us completely off center. Now, the form of that being knocked completely off center means vulnerability to any insult coming from the environment. That means that an emotional stimulus could push us into a psychosis. We're so chaotic, our responses are so chaotic that it could push us into a psychosis. Or, on the physical realm, it could push us into an autoimmune disease, or it could push us into a cancer. And the correlation with that is that fright is an overwhelming experience, right? an experience in which one is powerless to contend with the overwhelming experience of insults from outside. And again, you can think about that strictly in a physical sense, and you can think about that in a non-physical sense. So if you want to experience what it feels like to be, for example, in a powerless situation in which you're overwhelmed by something, strap yourself into a 2,000-pound box of metal and hurl it at something. Right? Now, that's why so many simple motor vehicle accidents yield chronic pain. Because that's an experience of powerlessness. And if you've been in, as many of us have in your life, also experienced perhaps more injurious or nefarious situations in which your boundaries were overwhelmed by an injurious insult, and you were powerless to do something about it, that predisposes you, even in the instance of motor vehicle accidents under 10 miles per hour or over 55 miles per hour, it doesn't matter. The likelihood of that person becoming subject to chronic pain is precisely because the chaos in their system this chaos has been introduced into the system. So when one is exhausted, then the chi is wasted. This reflects back to the notion that when you're sad, the chi dissipates. When you're in fear, it moves down. Exhaustion means that collapse is total. And this aspect, this lowest, deepest aspect of ourself is where you recollect your energy. So I'm up, I wake up with the dawn, I'm active throughout the day, I start moving myself towards greater relaxation so that when the sun goes down I can enter into sleep. And when I get, and as it happens, if this is 9 p.m. and this is 12 p.m., the quality of your sleep between those hours is like double in its benefits to any sleep that you get after those hours, right? So that's showing us exactly the same pattern, which is that your body, it's as if your body recollects its energy in sleep. And if that's exhausted, then it's pouring out. Now, how does that reflect physically? Physically, that'll reflect with incontinence, right? If your body's physically not collecting, then you'll have incontinence of urine, you'll have incontinence of stool. Any situation in which you can't hold on to the energy that you've brought into your body, right? That could also mean you could also have incessant diarrhea in that state. Because the body's not collecting it, because the system has been pushed to a state of exhaustion. And then lastly, when one is pensive, the chi lumps together. And that means, right, if we're taking in matter into our stomach and it's trying to make flesh of it, and that flesh is the physicality of our being. It's the state of our embodiment. And if we're arresting that through overuse of the mind, through pensiveness and rumination and thinking on the same thing, then that stops up this movement of this transformation. And it's as if we're collecting all of this substance, right? And that's like cortisol. That's like cortisol is a reflection of this kind of pensiveness, and then the chi lumps together. All right. Now, this insight is precisely a description of how every emotion, we can attribute all these emotions, but they reflect themselves as energy, movement, and direction that we can physically feel in our body. And then it will manifest itself, as we feel it in our body, it will manifest itself. If we're not able to be attentive to it, right? If all of the responses that the body makes are responses to the influences that are coming into our life, and we cannot feel them when they're coming in, so that process becomes arrested, that arrested process becomes one of these patterns. And it's a feeling that if you can identify it at first, if, for example, something fearful comes towards me and I can identify it, then I can let it go, right? If I have a tendency, if I have this pattern that I want to I want to dwell on things, if I can learn to not, if I can identify the feeling that arises in my abdomen when I feel like, oh, I'm all worked up and I'm thinking, I can't stop thinking about this thing. Or instead, if it's in our head, it would be the same thing. Like, oh, I get this headache because I'm constantly thinking about this thing. If I can learn to identify the sort of prodromal signs of those felt senses in my body, then I can not get arrested in one of these. I will not be arrested in one of these movements. And any influence that comes out into my experience, whether it's a physical one or an emotional one or a mental one, I can identify it right away, and then it untangles itself and it doesn't become a fixed part of my experience. So in a way, you could go so far as to say any disease that you can identify is a kind of fixed idea about that your body is holding about how to relate to its experience. Now, there's a tried and true way of coming to terms with this. This text here is an inscription that was on a jade walking stick handle. And the name of that handle is, that archaeological find is the duodecagonal jade inscription on the circulation of the breath. And I say that 10 times fast. So this is, in other words, this is the earliest description in China of a written description of how to meditate on the breath. And the meaning of meditating on the breath is to be able to be cognizant and aware of those experiences that we're having, and then to let go of them. And the benefits of that to our mental health are infinite, practically. So to circulate the qi, swallow it so that it will accumulate. As it accumulates, it will expand. As it expands, it will descend. As it descends, it will stabilize. As it stabilizes, it will consolidate. As it consolidates, it will sprout. As it sprouts, it will grow. As it grows, it will return. As it returns, it will merge with heaven. The heavenly impulses are revealed in the rising of qi. The earthly impulses are revealed in the descending of qi. Go along with this and you will live. Go against it and you will die. So that's the conclusion. Any questions about that? Yeah.
Distinct from circulation, can qi rotate?
Can qi rotate?
Yeah.
Can you give me an example of what you mean?
Like, I imagine sort of like all of this expanding, contracting,
Mm-hmm.
moving, being sort of like a thing.
Okay, so yeah, so take this image. I'm actually going to be bold and use the second sheet if I can. So we have this image, and that was our number 6. So the next number, now incidentally, 6 is a description of all the channels in the human body. There are 6 of them. Those are the Shaoyin, the Jueyin, as I was describing them. And of course, our bodies, there's no such thing as an acupuncture channel. Right? There's not like a tube in my body that's an acupuncture channel that I'm sticking needles into. There is like the 3-dimensional body, right? So the same thing is true here. So you can take this image, and so the number 6 is written like this, right? Which is like, well, not exactly like that. Like that, which is an image of the human being like this. And I'm taking in the influences of heaven, and I'm also bringing in the influences of earth through my feet. And I do that through the channels. Well, the number 7 is like that. And that is that's a description of this right here. That's the description of this moment, right? Here's that, and oh, look what's coming up out of the ground. So we have this image where we've moved from an organization according to 5, and then we've introduced a quality of movement. So we've taken this and we've spun it. So it's spinning around, and then when we emerge out of the depths and out of the unseen and into the manifest, then it's going like this, and it's going like this. Then we go to 8, right? 8 is another way of describing yin and yang with the 4 directions, right? So that now we have an above and a below, and this thing happening all the time like this. Well, guess what that means? Like, when we do that, we're taking this image that's spinning around wildly in space, and as I was saying, it's constantly going back like this. And that's also moving around in all of those vectors. And so what you actually have is like that this is turning into that spinning around, right? As this is going back to this center, which is our physical body, that within our physical body, with all of these energetics happening in every single direction constantly, simultaneously, autopoetically, and mycellulally, we're getting this infinite, this symbol, the lemniscate. And if we also recognize that that lemniscate is also moving in all directions, then we have a torus, right? Then we have like a donut, a cosmic donut. So that the energy's coming in like this all the time, and going all the way, going like this all the time, and like this all the time. So it's going in and out and around itself and spinning around simultaneously. So yeah, it does all those things. Right, and again, like I said, the mystery of that is that all of that's described in this unfolding of number and pattern. Any other questions?
What would be a Chinese idea from what you've spoken about to train staying in center, resisting being knocked off balance?
So let's say to speak to this from a so this is the physical body. The earth is the physical body, and it's the digestive system which makes up our physical body. The basis for staying in center is that as an infant, when all I am is pure need, something outside of myself with minimally egocentric, unconditional love attends to my every need, right? So as an infant, I am nourished by a caregiver, nourished by a caregiver, nourished by a caregiver. By the time I'm, say, 10 years old, and then I develop through my ability to take in influences from outside and do something with them. So then when I'm reaching my tweens or my teens, the same expression of minimally egocentric, unconditional love will be to allow me to meet my own needs. To not cater to my every need, but to allow me to test reality and find out how can I take care of myself. So also on the basis of that, right? So that means that that's a way of framing the want of the stomach that Kevin was talking about. The want that Kevin was talking about that I would equate with the activity of the stomach and the mouth. The yang aspect of that. And then the yin aspect of that is that I can kind of turn it into substance. So being able to stay in center means that I have a realistic, tested understanding that if I have a need, I'm worthy of having that need met. And if I'm capable of meeting that need on my own. And therefore I'm centered and grounded. And no matter what comes into my experience, I know that either I can rely on someone else to help me, or I don't need help and I can take care of it myself. That's the quality of being present in the earth and present in the center. And in a human person, that's predicated precisely on the quality of bonding that occurs between, first, a principal caregiver, and the child, and then later that child and anyone else in whom they create a bond. Now the fact is that that quality of creating the bond is also governed by the earth and its relationship to the metal over here, because that means that I can augment my sense of self by the bonds that I initiate outside of myself. And in order to take and to make a bond and make something part of me, I have to also make room for it. So it's through the interaction of these two things that can actually happen. Right? So in other words, in this aspect of things, my sense of self changes through the rites of passage that I go through. So the first one is, and that means that I start out with this bond where I'm held within my family's system, and then I transcend that family system and I go to school, and then when I'm in school, I have this momentary separation, and then I establish new bonds. Right? I establish a bond with a surrogate caregiver in the form of a teacher. And then I start to recognize that, hey, they're a teacher, I'm a student, there's all these other students, I'm going to form bonds with all those other students. And then so there's like chumship, right? And that's like another level of bonding and initiating bonding. And then as I start to gain a fuller sense of myself as an autonomous individual, I think like, oh, I really want to look outside of myself and see the people that actually I share something with, and then I'm going to initiate bonds with those people, right? And then ultimately, I'm going to bring that out of a friend context and into like a romantic or a kind of like love context, where I'm going to allow someone. My chums, I don't let them come close to my heart as I would an intimate partner, and so I need to develop discernment and I need to develop discernment and proper spacing and timing of the interaction of my heart with other hearts, so that I can safely choose partners to take into my innermost heart experience. So yeah, all of it, but embodied, basically. Yeah.
I don't know much about thermodynamics, but the one thing I always think about is energy can either be created or destroyed. And I keep coming back in many of the principles that you're talking about, you haven't talked about, this concept of hoarding, wanting more than we have capacity to manage or flow or use, or and I'm thinking about it from what you just talked about. Oh,
Yeah.
Good, look at you. That's where I was going with this. Yeah.
So that's pensiveness and clumping and lumping and holding on to something.
Mm-hmm.
Now the fact is, as I hope I communicated, right? I might have my vulnerabilities. Like for example, my father had heart arrhythmias, and then later had a stroke, and that's how he passed away. And so he had this, like, all of his adult life he had these heart arrhythmias that would lay him out. Well, so like in a sense, that's where one of my vulnerabilities is. Like my heart is also a little bit weak. I don't have those symptoms, and that's precisely because I don't push myself the same way that my father did. Like I take naps. Well, but I inherited some of that. So that the fact is, though, that whenever I'm under stress, like that's where it's going to go, right? Like that's an aspect of my vulnerability. I inherited that vulnerability, and then I've been eating this diet of ramen noodles for the last 5 years. Like I only eat instant ramen, so I have like a little bit of digestive trouble. I've set up so I've set up my own, through my lifestyle, I've set up a vulnerability there. And that would be an example of a weird form of hoarding also, right? Like I just do this one thing, I only do this one thing. Well, now think about that on like a cellular level, right? Because it's doing the exact same thing that it's supposed to do all the time. It's all it does, it only does that. And in a way, that's kind of like pensiveness, right? But that's also the benefit of that is that's what keeps the bounds of the cell together. right? Like, so the fact is, what if you could actually bring awareness, right? You could bring heart awareness into contact with that cell, and you could harness that cell to become like, not just to keep doing what it's doing, but to keep doing what it's doing imbued with awareness. Right now, that's like getting a little weird. That's like saying that you can take, that if we can bring that same felt sense that we can bring to like, so I can identify that whenever I experience stress, right, I might feel it right here. This is like a common way that people, when they experience stress from outside, they kind of like tense up like this, and then they develop pain under the ribs. And so I can identify that. So I can be like, oh wow, geez, I just got that thing. What in my life am I stressed about? Like, what can I change? What am I doing that's giving rise to this? What's in my environment that I could do something about? Right? How can I take responsibility for this symptom that I'm experiencing? Well, now imagine if you could similarly bring that level of awareness like right down to each individual cell. If you could identify that the activity of that cell, like you could liberate the activity of that cell. That's going to transform humanity, right? That means that if we accept evolution on this individual level, and this is equally true of social structure also, right? The potential to kind of harness the power of awareness and embody that awareness, and then connect the heights of our awareness to the depths of our being through the physicality of our body, then the potential is like for that to then launch a whole new level of integrated cycling through human experience. Right? And so here you have like where we are in presently is, right, humans emerged somewhere. I'm super fascinated by the notion that it was domesticating dogs and not agriculture that gave rise to civilization. That's profound. So here I am like in this undifferentiated state, and then I become aware of something outside myself. So in my little band outside of the campfire's edge, I'm aware that there's something there. And I want to figure out what it is, and I want to connect to it somehow so that I can gain control over it. And then as I emerge from that state, then I might start creating a narrative around that. And so you have like an archaic social consciousness, you have like a magic social consciousness, and then you have like a mythic social consciousness. And then that gives rise to a mental rational consciousness. This is like derived from the work of a philosopher named Jean Gebser. Right, so you have this mental rational. Now, so the mental rational has allowed us to pursue science and to try to exert the same amount of control we were trying to use with magic, with mental rational spheres. But if we can bring all of those things simultaneously into awareness, just as we could bring our awareness into like the cells themselves, then we can radically transform that. And we can then have all of these aspects of consciousness simultaneously and completely aware. It's present to us now. Well, so, that's really what I'm kind of going for. It's like, okay, how can I bring people not only into a level of awareness where their heart awareness is heightened so that they can identify the symptoms in their body, but actually how can they bring their awareness into such a state of complete embodiment that they can actually transform their experience? That's my shtick. Any others?
Is there sort of a concept of the chi of an entire group, or is it one sort of individual?
Oh, definitely. There's definitely the chi of an entire group. So where are you going with that?
What would that look like in the diagram? No. So it's sort of like nested in a way, right?
Yeah, nested is a perfect word to describe it. So the way that would play out is that, like I'm saying, let's look at this again. So this is the I am, and then this is the no I am not, and then this is the work I have to do to be myself, and then this is the full affirmation of myself, and then this is my assimilation of that sense of self into a deeper state of embodiment. It's also like I'm alive, my blood is circulating, I'm in contact with my environment, I'm being myself, I'm digesting the bacon that I ate earlier, and I'm also going to eliminate it later. And then, right, it's like, so all of those things are all happening simultaneously. So in fact, these are also nested in the same way. So in any social group, right, well, somebody's going to be an asshole. And somebody's going to be like so confidently self-aware that they're going to naturally assume a position of, like, as Kevin was saying, like the person who has the the greatest want and is like in contact with that and fully expressing it through the heart being, which is here, the heart aspect of the self, which is here, is going to, in a non-coercive situation, will be able to freely express that. Now, if that heart aspect of myself is likened to the canopy of a tree, right? I may not be like a super robust like oak tree, but I might be like a kind of bonsai tree. But if I'm like a bonsai and I'm like fully being a bonsai, and I'm like expressing my pure bonsai-ness, that means that I'm open 100% to the influence of heaven through the sun, right? As expressed through the sun. If I'm allowed to be precisely what I am in my pure bonsai-ness, then I'm the leader of the bonsais, right? Or if what we need in this organization is like, I need the bonsai to step up, like, call the bonsai in, then I'm coming into I'll be able to come in and be fully myself in the way that is absolutely necessary to the betterment of the whole system. And of course that's true, because if I'm trying to take care, if I'm trying to collect my energy when I should be expending my energy, then that's not going to work out well either. If I'm trying to recede into the depths when I should be fully actively fighting for what's right, that's not going to work either. So that's how it will play out. Yeah, so there's all of those functions will actually be, and in a way I'd like to, on the one hand we could say that that's almost like an archetype, like a Platonic ideal that's imprinted upon a community, but I don't like to think of it like that at all. I like to think of it instead as like an autopoietic system. So like, in one instance where somebody's being the problem, in another instance they're not going to be the problem, right? So it's not an ascent. There's nothing. If nothing is essentialized, that means that the freedom in the hunting situation of the wolves, that means that we can each occupy the place that we need to be in at the right time. And the human body, the physiology of the human body is just like that. Yeah. All right.
Can we talk about that a little bit more? So, people have autonomy.
Yeah.
And so I can understand the human system where they can adjust. How can the body adjust in the same way, or is it just sort of a response to stimuli? So you're talking about how when you're. I think what I heard you just say now is that when your body's in disarray, things aren't working together. How does it change?
So the one of the ways that the Chinese language expresses this is that we might think about there's yin and there's yang, but there's no such thing as yin and there's no such thing as yang. There's only yin and yang. There's only yin yang. Mm-hmm. And similarly, other things are divided in the same way. So like if you want to ask somebody like how much is it, it's duo shao, like it's a lot or a little. So a lot or a little means amount, right? So yin yang means everything. And So we can take all these things and we could say, likewise, you could say qi, blood, or you could say nourishing aspects of being and protective aspects of being, which in Chinese physiology, that's called yin and wei. So we have nourishing aspects and we have protective aspects. Those nourishing aspects and protective aspects means that I have, another way of defining that is like, one translator calls that camp chi and defense chi or something like that, right? So it means like, if I encounter something in my environment that is potentially injurious, I need to have the resources to bring a defense against that thing. So that means like, so I've been like very counter to most Chinese medicine thinking. Like I'm a big fan of like the cold shower and the cold plunge. And so I found that when I started doing the cold showers, right, like I would get in and I would feel like I'm suffering. And then I would feel like I could feel all the warmth in my body would come out to the surface. And it would meet that. And so it got to be like the water's pounding on this cold water's pounding on my back, and I feel it as warmth because my body's bringing the warmth to come into contact with the cold. And then it will retreat into my center. So I feel it like that. It's the yang qi, the wei qi is coming out and meeting that cold impulse. And then it goes back into the center and it stores itself. And so then I'm going into this, it's going into this deep part of the kidneys, and then it's available whenever I need it. I can just let it emerge out for activity.
Yeah.
So it's like that. Like the body always is going to adapt. And it's going to adapt, though. We can describe its capacity for adaptation as a balance between yin aspects, nourishing aspects, and defensive aspects. Another way of looking at that is like, and then you can extrapolate that to anything, right? So in a treatment, let's say I have a treatment of someone who's like in a really, really vulnerable state. The focus of that treatment is, can I identify where your resources are? Can I look at your body and can I use, traditional methods to understand where the resources are? And then can I augment those resources? So that's a way of saying an axiom in Chinese medicine is if there's too much, take some away. If there's not enough, add more. If I have a tumor and I go for surgery and they cut out the tumor, that could be a practice that would be utterly consistent with that maxim of Chinese medicine. The problem with surgery as a means of where it diverges from that is that it doesn't recognize the influence that that's going to have on the resources, right? It's like resources be damned, we got to get that tumor out. But if we can bring a process to, in my understanding, if we can bring a process of an understanding of yin and wei to Western medicine, then we have something like that will be infinitely more powerful.